The small, portable oxygen concentrator hummed softly on the grass beside 10-year-old Omar as he carefully arranged his collection of smooth river stones in elaborate patterns. His thin chest rose and fell in rhythm with the machine's gentle mechanical breathing. The clear plastic tubing curled around his ears, delivering life-sustaining oxygen to his chronically underdeveloped lungs. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the well-maintained lawn of Maplewood Circle, where 3 houses formed a small semicircle at the end of the quiet suburban street. Omar's cousins, Maya and David, sat cross-legged nearby, their voices bubbling with excitement as they described their latest school adventures. And then Mrs. Peterson said my volcano was the best in the whole class, Maya announced, her dark eyes sparkling with pride. It even made real smoke. That's amazing, Omar whispered, his voice soft, but genuinely enthusiastic. Speaking required careful breath management, each word measured and precious. I wish I could make one too. David, always the protective older cousin at 12, immediately moved closer to Omar. You could totally do it. We could help you build it right here in the backyard. Your dad has that whole workshop in the garage. The mention of his father brought a smile to Omar's pale lips. Councilman Ahmed Hassan was indeed a man of many talents. But more importantly, he was Omar's hero. Despite the demanding schedule of municipal politics, Ahmed never missed their evening conversations about everything from constellation patterns to the intricate workings of government. Omar's condition, a rare form of pulmonary fibrosis diagnosed when he was just 5, had initially devastated the family. But Ahmed had channeled that fear into fierce advocacy, becoming not just a city councilman, but a champion for disability rights throughout their district. The 3 children had been enjoying their peaceful afternoon for nearly an hour when the sharp click of heels on pavement announced an approaching presence. Karen Whitfield emerged from the pristine colonial house directly across the street, her platinum blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun that seemed to stretch the skin around her temples. At 43, she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of finding fault with others. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice cutting through the gentle afternoon air like a blade. "Excuse me, children?" Maya and David looked up curiously, but Omar's attention remained focused on his stones, carefully shifting a piece of smooth quartz to catch the light just right. The oxygen concentrator continued its quiet mechanical rhythm, no louder than a distant air conditioner or the hum of a refrigerator. Karen strode across the street with purpose, her navy blue blazer pristine despite the warm weather, her expression already twisted into the familiar mask of manufactured outrage that had become her signature look at every homeowners association meeting for the past 3 years. She had moved to Maplewood Circle with grand expectations of suburban perfection, only to discover that perfection, in her mind, required constant vigilance and frequent correction of others. "That machine," she announced without preamble, pointing directly at Omar's oxygen concentrator, "is making an absolutely intolerable amount of noise. It sounds like someone running a vacuum cleaner constantly. This is a residential neighborhood, not a medical facility." David stood up immediately, his young face flushing with indignation. "It's not loud at all. You can barely even hear it." "Don't you dare speak to me in that tone, young man," Karen snapped, her voice rising to a volume that was genuinely disturbing the peace. "I've been trying to enjoy a quiet afternoon on my own property, and that contraption has been disrupting my serenity for over an hour." Omar looked up for the first time, his dark eyes wide with confusion and the beginning of fear. His breathing quickened slightly, which made the concentrator adjust its rhythm automatically, a feature designed to respond to his body's changing needs. "I'm sorry if it's bothering you," he said quietly, "but I need it to breathe." "Well, you can breathe inside your own house," Karen declared, as if she had just solved a complex mathematical equation. There's absolutely no reason for you to be dragging medical equipment outside where it disturbs the entire neighborhood. This is supposed to be a peaceful community. Maya, who had been silent until now, found her voice. He's not hurting anyone. We're just playing quietly. Quietly. Karen's laugh was sharp and bitter. That machine is anything but quiet. And frankly, I don't think it's appropriate for children with special needs to be using our common areas as their personal medical facilities. There are places for that sort of thing. The words hung in the air like poison, each syllable designed to wound and exclude. David's hands clenched into fists. But Omar reached out and touched his cousin's arm gently, a gesture that spoke of years of learning to de-escalate situations that his very existence seemed to create in certain people's minds. "Please," Omar whispered, his voice barely audible over the soft hum of his life support system. "We're not causing any problems. The machine isn't loud. Dr. Martinez says fresh air is good for my lungs." But Karen had already made up her mind, and reason had never been her strong suit when righteous indignation took hold. "I don't care what any doctor says. This is my neighborhood too. And I have rights, property values, noise ordinances, community standards. These things matter." What happened next would be seared into the memory of everyone present for the rest of their lives. Karen, her face flushed with anger, and something darker, a cruel satisfaction that comes from exercising power over the vulnerable, reached down and yanked the power cord from Omar's oxygen concentrator. The gentle humming stopped immediately, replaced by an ominous silence that seemed to suck all other sound from the world. "There!" she announced triumphantly. "Problem solved!" Omar's reaction was immediate and terrifying. His breathing became labored within seconds, his chest working harder and harder to pull in the thin ambient air that his damaged lungs couldn't process efficiently. The color began to drain from his face as his oxygen saturation dropped, and his hands instinctively went to his throat in the universal gesture of someone unable to breathe. "Omar!" Maya screamed, rushing to his side as he began to sway. "Plug it back in! Plug it back in right now!" But Karen wasn't finished. With deliberate cruelty, she picked up the portable concentrator and hurled it toward the landscaped border between properties, where it landed with a sickening crash among the decorative bushes and mulch. The impact damaged the intake valve, and even when David frantically retrieved it and tried to restart the machine, it emitted only broken, stuttering sounds instead of its life-giving hum. "Now take your medical equipment and go inside where it belongs," Karen shouted, her voice carrying across the entire circle. "Some of us moved here for peace and quiet, not to live next to a hospital." Omar collapsed to his knees on the grass, his body fighting desperately for oxygen as his cousin surrounded him with protective desperation. Maya was crying now, her young mind unable to process the deliberate cruelty she had just witnessed. David had his phone out, frantically dialing 911 with shaking fingers while trying to comfort Omar with his other hand. "Stay with us, Omar," David pleaded, his voice cracking with fear. "Just breathe slowly. Help is coming." From across the street, Karen watched the scene with cold satisfaction, apparently unmoved by the sight of a child struggling for breath. "Maybe next time they'll think twice about disturbing the neighborhood," she muttered, loud enough for the children to hear. What Karen didn't know, what she couldn't have known because she had never bothered to learn anything about her neighbors beyond their potential impact on her property values, was that, at that very moment, just 3 blocks away in the community center, Councilman Ahmed Hassan was wrapping up the monthly town hall meeting. The meeting had run longer than usual, with heated discussions about the proposed new accessibility improvements to the downtown district. improvements that Ahmed had been championing as part of his ongoing commitment to making their city truly inclusive. The Americans with Disabilities Act isn't just federal law, Ahmed was saying to the packed auditorium, his voice carrying the passion that had made him a respected figure in local politics. It's a moral imperative. When we create barriers, physical, social, or attitudinal, we diminish ourselves as a community. Every person, regardless of their abilities or challenges, has the right to participate fully in civic life. The applause was still ringing through the room when Ahmed's phone buzzed with an incoming call from David's number. He almost ignored it, knowing that the children were safely playing at home under the watchful eye of their grandmother, who lived next door. But something about the persistence of the call made him excuse himself from the post-meeting conversations and step into the hallway. "David, what's wrong?" The words that tumbled through the phone hit Ahmed like physical blows. "Uncle Ahmed, you have to come home right now." This lady, she unplugged Omar's oxygen and threw it in the bushes. She said he couldn't play outside anymore because of the noise. Omar can't breathe properly, and the machine is broken, and she's still yelling at us. The phone slipped from Ahmed's suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering on the polished floor of the community center hallway. The sounds around him, the murmur of departing attendees, the scrape of chairs being stacked, the casual conversations about weekend plans, all faded into background noise as his mind processed what he had just heard. Someone had deliberately disconnected his son's life support system. Someone had put Omar in immediate physical danger, not through accident or ignorance, but through calculated cruelty. And that someone was apparently still outside, still tormenting his child while he struggled to breathe. Ahmed's transformation was immediate and complete. The composed public servant vanished, replaced by a father whose child was in mortal danger. He snatched up his phone and called 911, while simultaneously pushing through the community center doors, his dress shoes pounding against the pavement as he ran toward his car. "I need police and paramedics at 847 Maplewood Circle immediately." He spoke rapidly into the phone while fumbling for his keys. "A disabled child has been deprived of necessary medical equipment. This is a medical emergency and possible assault." Behind him, the town hall attendees who had witnessed his sudden departure began to murmur with concern. Sarah Chen, the longtime city clerk, approached the doors just in time to see Ahmed's sedan disappearing around the corner with unusual speed. "Something's happened to Omar," she said quietly to the small group that had gathered. Sarah had known the Hassan family for years, had watched Omar grow from a frightened 5-year-old, fresh from his diagnosis, into the thoughtful, gentle boy he was today. Ahmed would never leave a meeting like that unless... The sentence hung unfinished, but everyone understood. Within minutes, a small convoy of cars was making its way toward Maplewood Circle, carrying people who had just spent 2 hours discussing community values and the protection of vulnerable citizens. They had no idea they were about to witness those principles tested in the most immediate and personal way possible. Back at the scene, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Omar's breathing had become increasingly labored, despite David's attempts to jury-rig the damaged oxygen concentrator. The machine would sputter to life for a few moments before cutting out again, its broken intake valve unable to maintain consistent pressure. Maya had run to get their grandmother, but Mrs. Nazir was elderly herself and could only offer comfort while they waited for help to arrive. Karen, rather than showing any concern for the child she had endangered, had retreated to her front porch, where she continued to hold court, like some twisted queen of suburban righteousness. "I hope this teaches them a lesson about respecting community standards," she announced to anyone within earshot. "Maybe now they'll keep their medical issues where they belong, behind closed doors." Her words carried clearly across the circle, reaching Omar's ears and adding psychological trauma to his physical distress. The boy, who had never asked for anything more than the right to play quietly in his own yard, now found himself gasping for breath while being lectured about his failure to conform to some imaginary standard of suburban perfection. The first sirens could be heard in the distance when Ahmed's sedan rounded the corner onto Maplewood Circle, traveling faster than the quiet residential street had ever witnessed. He was out of the car before it had fully stopped, his city council meeting attire incongruous with the desperate urgency of his movements as he rushed to where Omar knelt on the grass. "I'm here, buddy," Ahmed whispered, gathering his son into his arms with infinite gentleness. "Daddy's here. Just try to breathe slowly and easy. The paramedics are almost here." Omar's response was barely audible, but the relief in his eyes was unmistakable. "Dad, the lady. She said I couldn't." "Shh. Don't try to talk right now. Just focus on breathing." Ahmed's voice was steady and calm for his son's benefit, but his eyes were already scanning the scene, taking in the damaged oxygen concentrator in the bushes, the tear stains on his nieces' and nephews' faces, and the woman on the porch across the street who was still holding forth about property values and community standards. The paramedics arrived within moments, their professional efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos that had preceded them. They immediately began assessing Omar's condition while setting up a portable oxygen supply to stabilize his breathing. One of them, a woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, spoke directly to Omar while she worked. "You're going to be just fine. Sweetheart, we're going to get you feeling better right away. Can you tell me your name?" "Omar Hassan." He managed between careful breaths of the supplemental oxygen. "I'm 10 years old." "Omar's a strong name. You're being very brave. Omar." The paramedic continued her assessment while her partner examined the damaged concentrator. "What happened to your oxygen machine?" Before Omar could answer, David stepped forward, his young face set with determination. "That lady over there." He pointed directly at Karen, who was now trying to retreat into her house. She unplugged it and threw it in the bushes. She said Omar was making too much noise and couldn't play outside anymore. The paramedic's expression darkened as she looked across the street at Karen's retreating figure. "Someone deliberately disconnected a child's medical equipment." "That's correct," Ahmed said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled fury of a man trying to remain civilized in the face of unthinkable cruelty. "My son was playing quietly on our own property when this woman decided his breathing equipment was too loud for her taste." The police officers who had arrived with the paramedics immediately began taking statements from the children and examining the damaged equipment. Officer Martinez, a veteran of 23 years on the force, had seen many forms of cruelty in his career, but the deliberate endangerment of a disabled child struck him as particularly heinous. "Mr. Hassan, I'm going to need to speak with the woman who did this. Can you point her out?" Ahmed gestured toward Karen's house, where the front door was now firmly closed and the curtains drawn. Karen Whitfield, 843 Maplewood Circle. She was very vocal about her actions, made no attempt to hide what she was doing. As Officer Martinez approached Karen's front door, the small convoy from the community center began arriving. Sarah Chen was the first to reach the scene, her face pale with shock as she took in the paramedics working on Omar, the damaged medical equipment, and the obvious distress of everyone involved. "Ahmed, what happened? Is Omar all right?" The story, when Ahmed related it in his calm, measured voice, sent ripples of shock and outrage through the growing crowd of town hall attendees. These were people who had just spent their evening discussing accessibility improvements and community inclusion. They had debated curb cuts and wheelchair ramps, had nodded approvingly at Ahmed's passionate speeches about dignity and equal access. Now they were confronted with the brutal reality of what discrimination looked like when it moved beyond policy discussions into actual violence against a child. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the longtime mayor, arrived just as Officer Martinez was knocking on Karen's door for the third time. "Ahmed, I came as soon as Sarah told me something had happened. How is Omar?" "He's stable now, thanks to the paramedics. But Patricia, what happened here today?" Ahmed's voice trailed off as he struggled to find words adequate to describe the deliberate cruelty his son had endured. Maya, who had been quietly crying throughout the ordeal, suddenly found her voice. She said he didn't belong outside. She said there were places for people like him, and this wasn't one of them. The words hit the assembled crowd like physical blows. Here were people who prided themselves on their progressive community values, who had just voted to spend significant municipal funds on accessibility improvements, confronted with evidence that their own neighbors harbored attitudes that belonged in a much darker era of American history. Karen's door finally opened to reveal a woman who looked significantly less confident than she had 20 minutes earlier. The sight of multiple police officers, paramedics, and what appeared to be half the city government gathered in her front yard had apparently given her pause to reconsider her earlier righteousness. "Officers, I don't understand what all this fuss is about," she began, her voice carrying a tremor that hadn't been there during her earlier tirade. "I simply asked some children to be more considerate of their neighbors." Officer Martinez consulted his notes. "Ma'am, we have multiple witness statements indicating that you deliberately disconnected a disabled child's oxygen equipment and threw it into landscaping, causing damage to the device and immediate medical distress to the child. Is that accurate?" The machine was making noise. "This is a quiet neighborhood. I have rights too." Karen's voice was rising again, but now it carried desperation rather than authority. "You have the right to remain silent," Officer Martinez replied grimly, reaching for his handcuffs. "Karen Whitfield, you're under arrest for endangering the welfare of a child, destruction of medical equipment, and assault. You have the right to an attorney." The sight of Karen being led away in handcuffs, while Omar sat safely in his father's arms, breathing easily from the paramedics' oxygen supply, created a moment of profound symbolism that none of the witnesses would ever forget. This was justice in its most immediate form, not the abstract discussions of policy and procedure that filled most city council meetings, but the direct confrontation of cruelty with community solidarity. Dr. Reeves approached Ahmed as the police car disappeared around the corner. "Ahmed, I want you to know that the city will be pressing charges to the fullest extent of the law. What happened here today is not just criminal. It's antithetical to everything we claim to stand for as a community." "Thank you, Patricia. But more than legal consequences, I hope this serves as a wake-up call. There are Karen Whitfields in every community, people whose prejudices remain hidden until they're tested. Today, Omar was lucky. His cousins were with him. Help was nearby. And he survived what could have been a fatal encounter with someone's casual cruelty. The paramedics determined that Omar was stable enough to remain at home rather than requiring hospitalization, but they provided the family with a temporary oxygen concentrator while theirs was being repaired. As the various emergency vehicles began to depart, the crowd of community members remained, creating an impromptu gathering on the lawn where Omar had been playing just hours earlier. Sarah Chen was the first to speak what everyone was thinking. "We can't let this happen again. Not to Omar. Not to any child in our community." "What do you propose?" asked Councilmember James Wright, a man whose quiet demeanor masked a fierce commitment to social justice. "Education first," Dr. Reeves suggested. "Mandatory sensitivity training for anyone involved in community organizations. if people understood the realities of living with disabilities. Maybe we could prevent this kind of ignorance from turning into violence. But Ahmed, still holding Omar close, had a different perspective. Education is important, but it's not enough. Karen Whitfield knew exactly what she was doing when she endangered my son. This wasn't ignorance. It was deliberate cruelty born from a sense of entitlement to other people's dignity and safety. Omar, who had been quietly listening to the adult conversation, surprised everyone by speaking up. Maybe if people met me first, before they decided I didn't belong somewhere, they wouldn't be so scared of my machine. The wisdom in those words, coming from a 10-year-old who had just survived a traumatic assault, left the adults momentarily speechless. Here was a child who, despite having his life threatened for the crime of existing in public space, was still thinking about how to bridge the gap between fear and understanding. Maya, who had been unusually quiet since the arrest, suddenly perked up. We could have a block party, not just our circle, but the whole neighborhood. People could meet Omar and see that he's just a regular kid who needs a little help breathing. The idea gained immediate traction among the adults, who recognized the profound truth in what the children were suggesting. Community healing would require community engagement, and isolation had clearly not protected Omar from prejudice and violence. Over the following weeks, the incident on Maplewood Circle became a catalyst for change throughout the city. Karen Whitfield was formally charged with child endangerment, destruction of medical equipment, and violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Her defense attorney tried to argue that she had merely been protecting her property values. But the prosecutor, armed with clear video evidence from multiple security cameras and the testimony of 3 child witnesses, had little difficulty proving both criminal intent and discriminatory motivation. The civil rights lawsuit that followed would eventually result in a substantial settlement for Omar's family, money that they donated to establish a community fund for accessible playground equipment and disability awareness programs in local schools. But more immediately, Karen faced the loss of her house when the legal fees and damages exceeded her ability to pay, a form of poetic justice that demonstrated the real cost of choosing cruelty over compassion. The neighborhood block party took place 6 weeks later, on a sunny Saturday that reminded everyone of the afternoon when everything had changed. Omar, now equipped with a newer, even quieter oxygen concentrator, served as the unofficial host, greeting neighbors with the same gentle courtesy that had characterized him before his ordeal. Many adults approached him with obvious nervousness, unsure how to interact with a child whose very existence challenged their assumptions about normalcy and belonging. But Omar, with the resilience that seemed to characterize children who had faced serious medical challenges from an early age, made it easy for them. He explained his condition simply and without self-pity, demonstrated how his equipment worked, and answered questions with the patience of someone much older. By the end of the day, he had transformed from the mysterious disabled child who disrupted property values into Omar Hassan, the kid who knew more about astronomy than most adults and who was working on a science project about renewable energy. The empty house across the street, where Karen had once held court from her front porch, stood as a silent reminder of the consequences of choosing division over unity. The new family who eventually moved in made a point of introducing themselves to Omar personally, and their daughter quickly became his closest friend in the neighborhood, unburdened by the prejudices that had poisoned the previous residents' worldview. At the next town hall meeting, held in the same community center where Ahmed had received the panicked phone call about his son, the discussion focused not on accessibility improvements in the abstract, but on the concrete experiences of disabled community members and their families. Omar himself addressed the crowd, his young voice steady and clear as he spoke about the simple desire to play outside without fear, to exist in public spaces without justifying his presence, and to be seen as a person first, rather than a collection of medical equipment and limitations. The standing ovation that followed his remarks lasted for nearly 5 minutes, but more importantly, it led to concrete policy changes. The city established a new civil rights enforcement unit, specifically tasked with investigating discrimination complaints. Local schools implemented comprehensive disability awareness curricula, and most significantly, the community created a network of support that ensured no disabled resident would ever again face harassment alone. Ahmed, reflecting on the events months later, recognized that while the attack on his son had been traumatic and inexcusable, it had also revealed the fundamental decency of most people when directly confronted with injustice. The same neighbors who had remained silent about Karen's previous complaints about noise and property values had rallied immediately when her prejudice turned violent. The same community leaders who had treated accessibility as a budget item rather than a human right had responded with swift action when faced with the reality of discrimination. Omar's recovery, both physical and emotional, became a testament to the power of community support in healing trauma. The boy who had collapsed on his own lawn, gasping for breath while being lectured about his failure to conform, grew into a confident young advocate who spoke at schools and community events about the importance of inclusion and understanding. His gentle manner and obvious intelligence challenged every stereotype about disabled children, forcing people to confront their assumptions about capability, worth, and belonging. The damaged oxygen concentrator, repaired and returned to service, continued its quiet mechanical breathing alongside Omar's biological breathing, the two rhythms creating a soft harmony that neighbors had learned to associate not with disruption, but with the sound of a child living fully, despite significant challenges. The machine that had once been called intolerable noise had become, for those who knew its importance, the sound of perseverance and hope. On quiet afternoons, when Omar sat on the same lawn where he had nearly died, arranging his river stones in patterns that caught the light just right, the neighborhood children would often join him. They had learned to appreciate the careful way he moved through the world, the thoughtfulness with which he approached every activity, and the joy he found in simple pleasures that others took for granted. His presence had taught them that difference was not deficiency, that needing help was not weakness, and that community was strengthened rather than weakened by embracing all its members. The empty space where Karen's hatred had once festered became filled with something far more powerful: the recognition that a truly inclusive community required active protection of its most vulnerable members. The adults who had witnessed Omar's ordeal carried that lesson forward into their professional lives, their civic engagement, and their daily interactions with others who might be seen as different or challenging. And in the end, perhaps that was the most profound victory of all. One child's courage in the face of cruelty had not only secured justice for himself, but had transformed an entire community's understanding of what it meant to protect and cherish every person within its borders. The gentle hum of Omar's oxygen concentrator continued to mark the rhythm of life on Maplewood Circle, but now it was heard by ears that understood its significance, not as disruption, but as the sound of a community that had learned to breathe together, supporting each member's right to exist, to thrive, and to play freely under the open sky.